The twin suns hung mercilessly in the sky, their unrelenting heat baking the golden sands of the desert into a shimmering, shifting inferno. Jiren trudged forward, the weight of his scavenger's pack and the oppressive heat pushing him to his limits. The brim of his battered hat shielded his face, but the blazing light seemed to pierce through every layer, turning the world into a blinding haze. He stopped atop a towering dune, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. This planet unforgiving and unnamed was home only to the desperate. For Jiren and the settlers clinging to survival in their makeshift domes, it wasn't home by choice. It was a prison of circumstance. Far below, the wreckage of a mining shuttle lay sprawled across the dunes, its twisted metal carcass half buried in the sand. Jiren squinted, disappointment etching deeper lines into his weathered face. He had hoped to find untouched salvage, something overlooked in the settlers' frenzied raids. But the remnants glinted dully, stripped of anything valuable. Cursing under his breath, he adjusted his pack and prepared to head back. The settlement's domes, patched together with scavenged scraps, were barely visible through the sweltering haze. But as he turned, something caught his eye. A glint, a flicker of light that didn't belong to the wreckage or the endless expanse of sand. Jiren froze, instincts honed by years in this wasteland kicking in. Mirages were common here, cruel tricks of the twin suns, but this was no illusion. The shimmer held an unnatural quality, an otherworldly brilliance. His pulse quickened, curiosity battling caution as he descended the dune. Each step sank his boots deeper into the scorching sand, but he pressed on, drawn by the inexplicable glow. At the base of the dune, the anomaly took form. Jiren stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. A figure lay motionless on the sand, partially obscured by the swirling grains. It was a woman or something resembling one. Her elongated form shimmered with a strange iridescence, her skin shifting between hues of violet and silver. Long hair, dark as the void, spilled across the sand, glistening as though woven with threads of starlight. Even in the stillness of death or perhaps sleep, she radiated an unsettling grace. She didn't belong here. Jiren approached cautiously, his hand hovering near the dagger at his waist. His shadow fell over her, but her serene features remained untouched by the desert's cruelty. There was no sweat on her skin, no signs of the harsh elements that defined this world. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice nearly drowned out by the whispering wind. Her eyes snapped open. Vivid violet light pierced through him, freezing him in place. Images flooded his mind towers of crystalline beauty, skies painted with impossible colors, and beings of breathtaking grace moving in harmony. The visions overwhelmed him, leaving his knees weak. Then her voice, soft yet commanding, echoed in his mind. Zanira, Jiren staggered back, his head spinning. Whatever this being was, she was no ordinary survivor. She was something beyond his understanding, a force he couldn't ignore. The air around her hummed faintly, and Jiren realized with a chill that it wasn't just the desert playing tricks on him. This woman Zanira was alive, and her very presence was altering the world around her. Steeling himself, Jiren reached out a tentative hand. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice firmer this time. Zanira sat up slowly, her movements deliberate. Her glowing eyes locked onto his, unreadable and ancient. Then, without a word, she rose to her feet, her stature imposing yet delicate. As they began the long trek back to the settlement, Jiren couldn't shake the feeling that his life and perhaps the fate of this barren world had just changed forever. The settlement loomed ahead, a stark contrast to the endless dunes. A cluster of patched domes and makeshift towers, its survival depended on the grit of its inhabitants. The settlers, hardened by years of struggle, viewed outsiders with suspicion, and Zanira wasn't just an outsider. As they crossed into the settlement, activity ground to a halt. Men and women paused in their tasks, their weathered faces etched with wariness. Whispers spread like wildfire, eyes darting toward Zanira's shimmering figure. The stark sunlight only amplified her alien beauty, her skin glinting with iridescent hues that defied explanation. "What's this?" a sharp voice barked, cutting through the murmurs. Jiren turned to see Vorn striding toward them, his broad frame and scarred face exuding authority. He was the de facto leader here, a man whose pragmatism bordered on ruthlessness. His calculating eyes swept over Zanira, narrowing with interest. "She's not from here," Jiren said, his voice steady despite the tension. "No kidding," Warren replied, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Where did you find her? And more importantly, why did you bring her here? She needs help," Jiren answered firmly. "Help?" Voren's laugh was cold, his gaze fixed on Zanira like she was a valuable piece of salvage. "She doesn't look like she needs help. She looks expensive." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. The settlers traded in scraps and trinkets, their survival reliant on off-world traders who paid handsomely for rare finds. To Vorn, Zanira wasn't a person, she was an opportunity. "She's not for sale," Jiren said, his voice hardening. "Everything here has a price." Jiren, Vorn shot back. "You know that," the crowd murmured, unease rippling through the settlement. Zanira remained silent, her glowing violet eyes scanning the crowd with an unsettling calm. The air seemed to grow heavier, an almost imperceptible hum radiating from her presence. "What is she?" Vorn demanded, his voice rising. "And what trouble have you dragged into our midst?" "She's not trouble," Jiren replied, surprising even himself with the conviction in his voice. "She's different." "Different," Warren sneered. "Different gets us killed out here." Before Jiren could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. A faint vibration at first, it quickly grew into a rumble that sent sand cascading from the domes. The settlers froze, their eyes wide with fear. "What the hell was that?" Warren growled, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his belt. Jiren turned to Zanira, whose gaze had shifted to the horizon. Her glowing eyes narrowed, the faint hum around her intensifying. "They're coming," she said softly, her voice calm but laced with a quiet urgency. "Who?" Jiren asked, his stomach tightening. "The ones who hunt me." The sky darkened, the twin suns dimming as shadows stretched across the desert. Far off in the distance, dark shapes began to emerge, their movements unnaturally precise. "They're not human," Jiren muttered, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. "No, the rising wind. No," Zanira confirmed, her tone steady. "They are hunters, sent to capture me or destroy me." The air grew heavier, charged with an oppressive energy that made Jiren's skin prickle. The settlers scrambled to prepare, but their fear was palpable. Weapons were drawn, though they seemed pitifully inadequate against the looming threat. "You've brought hell to us, Jiren," Vorn snarled, his voice shaking with anger, "and now we all pay the price." Jiren ignored him, turning to Zanira. "Can you stop them?" She hesitated, the glow in her eyes dimming for a moment. "If I fight, this place may not survive." "My power, it's not stable here." "Then we fight together," Jiren said, gripping his blade tightly. Zanira's gaze softened slightly, a flicker of something almost like gratitude crossing her features. "You don't understand what you're offering," she said quietly. "Maybe not," Jiren replied, his voice firm. "But I won't stand by and watch them take you." The hunters drew closer, their shadowy forms now fully visible. Cloaked in dark, shifting armor, they moved with an eerie precision, their weapons glowing with a faint, menacing light. Zanira stepped forward, her presence commanding. The ground beneath her feet seemed to ripple, the air around her shimmering with a raw, otherworldly energy. "They won't stop," she said, her voice carrying an unspoken weight. "Not until one of us is gone." The first blast came without warning, a bolt of crimson energy tearing through the air and striking one of the domes. The structure collapsed in an explosion of sand and debris, the settlers scattering in panic. Jiren stood his ground, his pulse hammering in his chest. Beside him, Zanira raised a hand, and the very fabric of the desert seemed to bend to her will. Sand rose in spiraling waves, swirling around the settlement like a living barrier. For the first time, Jiren saw the full extent of her power, and it terrified him. "Stay close," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. As the hunters closed in, the line between survival and annihilation blurred. Jiren knew one thing for certain: the battle for Zanira's freedom and their lives had only just begun. The first explosion shook the ground, sending a cloud of debris skyward. The hunters had arrived, their dark forms silhouetted against the dimming light of the twin suns. Their weapons hummed ominously, arcs of crimson energy slicing through the air and striking the settlement with pinpoint accuracy. Jiren gritted his teeth, his blade in hand, though it felt woefully inadequate. Zanira stood at his side, her presence like an anchor amidst the chaos. The air around her shimmered with an almost unbearable energy, and the faint glow in her violet eyes began to intensify. "You can't fight them alone," Jiren shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the blasts. "I don't intend to," Zanira replied, her tone calm but resolute. She raised a hand, and the desert itself responded. The sands writhed like a living thing, rising in spiraling waves that shielded the settlement from the hunters' assault. The hunters hesitated, their weapons faltering against the unexpected resistance. But they regrouped quickly, their leader a towering figure cloaked in shifting shadows stepping forward. Its voice echoed through the settlement, cold and devoid of emotion. "Princess Zanira," it said, the disdain in its tone palpable. "Your defiance is futile. Surrender, and we will spare these insignificant creatures." Zanira's expression hardened. "You will not take me," she declared, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to reverberate through the very ground. The leader raised a hand, and a surge of crimson energy burst forth, slicing through Zanira's shield of sand. The settlers screamed as another dome collapsed, scattering debris across the settlement. Jiren lunged forward, gripping his blade tightly. "We can't just stand here," he shouted, turning to the settlers. "Help me fight them." But the settlers were frozen in fear, their weapons clutched uselessly in their hands. Only Vorn stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "This is madness," he growled. "But I'll be damned if I let them destroy everything." Before Jiren could respond, Zanira stepped between them and the advancing hunters. Her body glowed brighter, the air around her crackling with raw power. She extended both hands, and a shockwave erupted from her, hurling the nearest hunters back into the dunes. But the strain showed. Her movements slowed, and her breaths came in short, shallow gasps. The shimmering glow of her skin began to flicker. "Zanira, stop," Jiren shouted, rushing to her side. "You're pushing too hard. They will not stop," she replied, her voice steady despite the visible toll, "and neither can I." The hunter leader raised its staff again, and this time the energy it unleashed was devastating, a searing blast that tore through the sandstorm, heading straight for Zanira. Jiren didn't think. He acted. With a cry, he threw himself in front of her, the force of the blast slamming into him and knocking him to the ground. Pain coursed through his body, but he gritted his teeth and pushed himself up. "You're not doing this alone," he said, his voice hoarse but unwavering. Zanira looked at him, her glowing eyes softening. For a brief moment, her expression wasn't one of an alien princess or a powerful being. It was one of gratitude, almost human. The hunter leader stepped forward, its shadowy form towering over them. "You cannot win," it sneered. "Your power is unstable and your allies are weak." "This ends now." Zanira straightened, her body trembling, but her resolve unbroken. "You are right," she said, her voice steady. "It does end now." She raised her hands, and the desert responded in kind. The sands erupted in a violent storm, spiraling into a vortex of light and fury. The hunters faltered, their weapons useless against the raw, unbridled power Zanira unleashed. But Jiren saw the cost. Her shimmering skin dimmed further, her movements growing weaker with each passing second. She was pouring everything she had into this final act, knowing it would leave her with nothing. "Zanira, stop," he pleaded, his voice breaking. She turned to him, her glowing eyes meeting his. "Live," she whispered, her voice soft yet commanding. "Live and remember." With one final surge of power, Zanira unleashed a wave of light that swept across the battlefield, consuming the hunters and their leader in an instant. The storm subsided, leaving the desert eerily still, and Zanira was gone. Jiren knelt in the sand, his body aching and his mind reeling. In his hand, he clutched a shard of violet crystal, faintly pulsing with the energy she had left behind. The settlers emerged slowly, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Vorn approached, his usual bravado replaced by a rare solemnity. "She was more than we deserved," he said quietly. Jiren didn't reply. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where the twin suns were beginning to rise. Somewhere out there, he believed, Zanira's essence lingered, woven into the fabric of the desert itself. As he stood, the shard in his hand pulsed faintly, a reminder of her sacrifice and a promise that her memory would endure. And with that, Jiren turned toward the settlement, ready to rebuild and honor the legacy of the alien princess who had given everything to protect them.